Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SETA DC. Today we have a panel on Syria again, and we will discuss these processes, both the Astana process and Geneva processes, and try to have an answer about the question where Syria is heading, which we have been doing for the last 5-6 years. And I hope we will have a productive discussion and debate. I will basically cut this introduction short and just introduce the panelists today. We have Mona Yacoubian, Senior Advisor in the U.S. Institute of Peace, Andrew Tabler from Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy, and Hassan from Tahrir Institute, and Kadir Ustun from SETA DC. I will give them 10 minutes for their introductory remarks, and then we will start the Q&A session. We will start with Hassan, and Hassan, if you can provide us a historical development of these processes, and especially the possible impact of the Astana process to the possible Geneva process and its aftermath.
Thank you. Well, it's I think what matters today, I think, started in with the Russian intervention in Syria. Along the way, since September 2015 until now, the Russians have made great milestones along the way. I think three main ones. The first one was basically to ensure that Bashar Assad has won the strategic war in Syria. That happened, I think, in early 2016, when everyone, whether people in the region or outside in the Western world, recognized, probably not publicly, that Bashar Assad is here to stay, or at least the regime is here to stay. There's no real serious will to topple the regime as happened. So we started to see that desire, or kind of that dynamic playing out on the ground with the support of the Syrian opposition, or what kind of Syrian opposition is being supported. I think the second milestone was the summer of 2016, last year, when Turkey started to take a kind of a U-turn, or changed its position towards the Syrian conflict in terms of priorities, and from moving away, basically, in short, from removing Bashar Assad to trying to secure its borders and caring for its interests inside Syria. But back to the Geneva process and what Russia is doing today, whether in Astana or Sochi, is another milestone in changing the whole dynamics in the Syrian conflict. So the Vienna talks happened shortly after the intervention by Russia in 2015, and they led to a resolution called 2254. In that resolution, UN Security Council resolution, different nations of the Permanent Five agreed that there has to be a political transition in Syria. There has to be an election, and so on and so forth. So they agreed to a formula that 2 years later, exactly 2 years later today, we're not the whole kind of language there has been modeled and changed. So what we understand today about Geneva, the Geneva process has changed. The conversation has changed. The nature, even the kind of the specifics, while they still agree and talk about Geneva process and talk about political transition and talk about election, they're not talking about the same things that they talked about 2015. And that happened thanks to the Astana process and the change of the Turkish position inside Syria. And this is a process I call the Astanization of Geneva. What I mean by that is whatever Russia, Iran, and Turkey agree on in Astana shapes the conversation and changes the dynamics inside Syria in a way that whatever you talk about in Geneva, that conversation is shaped and defined by what happens before then. And Russia has managed to make so much progress along the way, even though U.S. officials keep talking about, and Andrew, I'm sure, is more knowledgeable about this. They, when they talk about we stick to the Geneva process, they don't actually know what they're talking about, because Geneva has changed in that sense. And Sochi recently the kind of convening the Syrian opposition to talk about the political track. In the SETA they talk about the military kind of aspect, so they bring military representatives of the Syrian opposition there, and they talk about different things. In Sochi, it has a more of a political identity to it, and in Sochi, they're also changing a lot of what's a lot of the landscape in Syria, much of the landscape in Syria, in the sense that they want the opposition that the West wants to be involved in the Geneva process to be redefined. So we're not talking about the same opposition that we know, who started the campaign against Bashar Assad. No, we're talking about something completely different. But Russia wants, and this is one of the mantras that Russia has been talking about or making for almost 2 years, is instead of talking about the Syrian opposition, they keep insisting on calling it Syrian oppositions. Mm-hmm. And what they do, and they do that because they want to broaden the spectrum of what it is when we talk about Syrian opposition. So, in fact, eventually, what they want to do is what we know as Syrian opposition will be a minority in a broader kind of spectrum inside Syria, and these will be involved with. These oppositions will include people who have worked with the Syrian regime through the reconciliation process inside Syria, through these ceasefires, local ceasefires. They want to include, obviously, the Kurds. They want to include others in order for them to accept whatever happens. Short of genius, what Russia has done in terms of slowly accepting things and then showing that they accept a major breakthrough like the UN Security Council 54, and 2 years later, even that is just a number. Like the language in it is too muddled, nobody knows what they're talking about. Even Europeans, when you talk to them, they say, how can you talk about a process like that without defining the terms, without defining who's who, and without even getting the two to talk to each other? It makes no sense.
Thank you, Hassan. Andrew, if you can give us a perspective about U.S. policy and positions about these processes.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for the invitation here today, and thanks for all of you for coming out for lunch. So most of the conversation for U.S. policy for the last few years has been based on what they call the Geneva Communique of June of 2012, and it's well known to, probably tattooed to the inside of many of our skulls in terms of the number of times it's been repeated, and it remains the key, one of the fundamental blocks of the U.S. position, and probably will going forward. But it's important to look at that original communique. Many pointed to the fact that it included mutual consent, and that essentially gave the opposition not a veto, but a very strong vote in terms of who would remain at the end of a transition process inside of Syria. But actually, my contention, and it has been for a long time, is that this document actually always allowed space for Assad to stay. I don't think it intentionally did, but I think it allowed a space for him to stay, and I think it's this loophole, so to speak, that the Russians are exploiting. So let me be specific. According to Section 2 of the Geneva Communique, a key step, quote, to any settlement of the crisis is the formation of a, quote, transitional governing body, or TGB, with, quote, full executive powers that will create a, quote, neutral environment in which a transition can take place, end quote. The TGB, and this is the key part, the TGB, quote, could include members of the present government and the opposition and other groups formed on the basis of mutual consent. So it's this ambiguity, because the current government, so to speak, is a fixed entity, right? It is what remains of, or what is now the Assad regime has evolved into, right? But the opposition is not a fixed quantity, or these other groups. It's more, it's less defined. And this ambiguity has encouraged Russia to allow, and the U.S. to push back against, Assad's inclusion in the in the TGB while remaining committed to the communique. So this is the way that Russia and the United States stay on the same page, is through this ambiguity, right? So we have two, and I'm not saying that, I don't think the U.S. is going to change its interpretation of the Geneva communique. I think the Russians have a different view of it. They're exploiting it and hoping that we'll all get tired of the Syria conflict and that down the road they'll whittle away and whittle away. They'll get a process going, a parallel process, and then they'll be brought into, and then finally, whatever process they have going will receive the Geneva Communique stamp of approval. Now that might not happen. I don't think it's the position of the U.S. for that to happen. I don't think it's going to. I don't think that's going to rhetorically change. But there is, I think, it's pretty clear that Russia is creating a parallel process through Astana. It's designed to bring in other groups into the process, and one of the key contentions in this whole process of the political, and it's the one big dividing line between Astana and Geneva, is the tension over what to do with the YPG Kurds. Yes. This is a huge, huge issue. And so now what's interesting also, it adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing in terms of how this will work, is that when the Geneva Communique was released, we thought this would dictate the process. But and Hassan mentioned this, when the Geneva Communique was further augmented by Security Council Resolution 2254, this, in my opinion, merged the Geneva Communique of 2012 together with what was then known as the Iranian four-point plan. Okay, and this is very important. The Iranian four-point plan, and see if this sounds familiar to you all, because I think it sounds familiar to me, includes an immediate ceasefire, formation of a national unity government, constitutional changes, and supervised elections. Right? And so that parallel process, propped up by the Russians in Astana, I think is designed to follow that general course that was inserted into 2254. Right? So the U.S. will continue, I think, to push for the Geneva Communique and its principles. It talks about an irrevocable transition, but the question is, do the parties on the ground follow that lead, or do they follow a Russian lead? And I think that's going to be a major issue going forward. The U.S. is committed to, and I think this is a result of largely what was inherited from the previous administration, but it was a trend on the battlefield for some time, with the intervention of Iran and Russia in Syria and the unwillingness of the United States to escalate or to bring about escalation dominance in that conflict. That emphasis was placed on a political solution, and I think the Russian plan is to try and push that process in favor of the Assad regime and the Russians as much as possible. How much that, and I think one of the big issues of contention is there's what U.S. position is on Syria. How that all fits into a larger plan of pushing back on Iran in the region is not clear to me at this point. And this is this could add a whole other layer of complexity. I don't want to predict, what will happen, but this introduces into the process factors that we might not have been able to take into account. And the reason why I bring this up is with the fall of Abu Kamal, I was very surprised. The Iranians are usually pretty, we say, gradual and oftentimes subtle chess players, but the taking of the T2 pipeline in Abu Kamal was so unbelievably brazen by various Shia militia propped up by the IRGC. And the level of Iranian-backed deployment in that area, I think inevitably, no matter what happens, because of the Assad regime's limited manpower, we're still going to be brought back to that problem. I don't know, and how that factors into the Iran strategy remains a big question in my mind. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kadir, the Turkey's position about the process?
Well, thank you, Kilic. Hassan actually mentioned it, and also Andrew mentioned Turkey to some extent. The Turkish involvement in the Astana process was tied to this, like Andrew was saying, the U.S. unwillingness to lead, both perhaps on the ground to some extent, and then diplomatically choosing to shame and blame Russia, but not taking the political lead, I would say. So there was a lot of frustration in Turkey about this. Turkey tried to, devise a strategy with the U.S. For a while, especially under Obama administration. That didn't work out. And then with Russia's involvement, intervention in Syria, things really started to change drastically. That basically Russia was able to deliver the regime, and then it was able to do things on the ground that the U.S. could not do or would not get involved. So Turkey's Hassan described it as kind of a shift or reprioritization of interests on the part of Turkey. That is true, but elements of those priorities, those strategic interests were there. The YPG's efforts to create itself a sort of small statelet in northern Syria was a concern from early on. Further refugee inflows in Turkey was a central concern, and continuing to make sure supporting the opposition that Turkey had invested so much. These were main concerns, and these seem to actually continue until today. But because of the U.S. support to YPG, they were able to reach areas that they couldn't possibly before reach and control. Like Raqqa right now, they're the predominant force there. So it's become a major irritant, to say the least, between U.S. and Turkey, but also it's become a serious threat. The threat perception for Turkey about YPG is really high. So when Russia tries to open that conversation about involving the YPG in the process in Geneva Process or Sochi or Astana, Turkey has strongly opposed it. What kind of formulation can be found about that? It's not clear. Turkey sees YPG as the same as PKK. It continues to insist on that, and it has, talked about how arms were transferred, and it's a serious threat to Turkey. So this is a major issue and major spoiler of any kind of potential political settlement, be it cooked in Astana and sort of rubber stamped in Geneva, or actually develops into a full political negotiation process in Geneva. Regardless, this is going to be a central concern for Turkey. And then what happens to the opposition, right? You guys talked about makeup of the opposition, which groups are involved. That's always been a problem, difficulty, it's a challenge. But at the end of the day, you have opposition groups aligned with Turkey that is working in Euphrates Shield area, also in Idlib. And these groups, I think Turkey will insist that are properly represented in the process. Whether Assad, we were discussing this early on, Assad runs in potential next elections, I think Turkey is not discussing that as much anymore, but from Turkish perspective, it's going to be a destabilizing factor. If Assad stays, runs for elections, we're not going to get to an actual stability and peace in Syria. So as a destabilizing factor alongside groups like YPG that are threatening Turkey directly, these are problems standing in the way of a political solution. And I think more broadly, there are a couple of geopolitical spoilers I want to just mention. Maybe we can discuss it further. The U.S. administration has been talking about confronting Iran, denying them further influence in the region, but it's not clear how they want to accomplish that. And especially in the Syrian scene, is that going to be a battleground for that struggle? Because U.S. has supported SDF. It has its about 2,000 troops in northern Syria. It's going to stay there for the short term, most likely medium term in Deir ez-Zor. And there's pro-Iranian groups, militias, and others as well. So is the U.S. going to choose to confront Iran, quote unquote, in Syria? I think that would be an important spoiler for stability and peace. I mentioned the U.S. partnership with YPG, Turkey's insistence that they can't be represented as YPG. I think Turkey would be fine with Arab-dominated rule in northern Syria, but YPG continues to be dominant militarily, so I don't know how we'll get there. And then we don't talk about it as much, but also Israel has concerns in the south. It wants some sort of buffer zone created between near Golan Heights. It wants to keep Hezbollah and Iranian militias far away from its border. And it actually, Netanyahu talked about permanent control over Golan Heights. It doesn't come up as much, but given that these parties have committed to territorial integrity of Syria, I think that's also a problem. So, or potential spoiler, let's say. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mona, if
Okay.
you can.
I'm batting cleanup,
yeah,
whatever,
cleaning up.
whatever the phrase is, whatever it's called. And I don't know that this is going to be very exciting because I find myself largely in agreement with pretty much everything that's been said. One thing I'm not in agreement with, though, is the title of this panel, because I don't think it's the Geneva Process that's going to lead us toward a political solution in Syria. It's really developments on the ground that are
So we need a question mark over here.
Absolutely. I think if you put a question mark, we'd be okay. But I think we can't, and I think it's basically come out in the various comments you've heard, but just to put a sort of emphasis and exclamation point on it, I think there are really two key trends that I see that will really shape where Syria goes over the next several months. And if there is a political solution, the political solution is going to be shaped by those developments on the ground. The first is the kind of the waning of the military campaign against ISIS. And I think what happens there, it has been brought out quite a bit by Kadir and to some extent by Andrew. The sort of the military, in quotation marks, defeat of ISIS, I think, is going to and has already begun to lead to new conflicts that have been residing just under the surface in Syria, whether it's Turkey and the Kurds, potentially the Syrian regime and the Kurds, the U.S. and possibly the Syrian regime, and certainly the U.S. and Iran. And I, too, share questions about how prominent, in particular, the U.S.-Iran confrontation will be. But there's no question that that's going to play a role in shaping what a solution, if one ever comes about, looks like and where things go. Secondly, the second key trend I see is that we are entering, in my view, the end game of the Syrian civil war. It will be a protracted and messy and violent endgame, but it does seem that we are very much in that endgame stage where we're beginning to see the final outlines of at least an interim, medium-term solution. It will feature, unfortunately, Bashar al-Assad remaining in power in Damascus, and I think that's part of what leads to the, I think, very astute analysis by Andrew of the Geneva Communique and how it could be interpreted in different ways. But I think it's not the Geneva process that will lead to a solution. It is, as Hassan rightly pointed out, the intervention of Russia that really turned the tide of the conflict and helped lead to the beginnings of the Assad regime consolidating its control over Western Syria. The fall of Aleppo in December of 2016 was another watershed event in that. And I don't see that trend shifting. Robin Wright has a piece today in which she is reporting that the United States has essentially acquiesced to Assad staying in power through 2021. We'll see whether that in fact is borne out in any other way. But we've also seen already, I think, Turkey and Saudi and this notion of the dilution of the Syrian opposition, where a more malleable Syrian opposition that does not insist on Assad leaving before any sort of transition begins. All of these, I think, point to that trend line of an endgame in Syria that features the continuation, at least in the short term, of the Assad regime in power. The other point I think we haven't talked about is kind of where Russia is going on this. What other moves does Russia have in order to help the regime consolidate its control? One thing that I'm keeping an eye on is the UN Security Council resolution, I believe it's 2332, which allows for cross-border assistance into Syria. That is up for renewal next month. And the Russians have indicated that they may be opposed to allowing for its renewal based on the notion of Syrian sovereignty, et cetera. I think this would have a significant impact on the ground. It would potentially put an end to the kinds of not just humanitarian assistance, but stabilization assistance flowing into southern Syria in particular from Jordan. This would basically compel assistance to go through Damascus, which would once again give Damascus even more control over parts of Syria that are now held by the opposition. Having met with some Syrian implementers from USAID just earlier this week, they have expressed concerns that you could end up seeing newly besieged areas, for example, in the south as the regime moves to extend its control. So that's another development, I think, that would be in line with this notion of an endgame and the Syrian regime consolidating its control. I essentially agree with the analysis I think I hear, which is essentially that the Geneva process has more or less been eclipsed, I think, by Astana, and that at least that's my view, and that if things will, again, driven by developments on the ground, things may move forward in a way in which there will be at least an attempt to get some sort of fig leaf political agreement that leaves the regime in control. I think the Russian preference would be that it have the international legitimacy of the United Nations. Now, again, does Geneva shift into a different Geneva process that essentially allows for that? I think we're already seeing moves in that direction. The insistence that Assad must leave before a transition has clearly eroded. And so I think that could be the case. That said, I also think, though, there are limits still to what Russia can do. The kind of the games that the Syrian regime played in this latest round of this 8th round of talks in Geneva, coming late, leaving early, staying out, going back, all of which, again, from the Syrian regime perspective, in opposition to the opposition's continued insistence that Assad would have to go. But I think that would not have been Russia's preferred approach, and it does suggest that the Syrian regime will continue to push back on some of these efforts. The other issues that I see going forward, the other tensions, I think the Kurdish issue is a critical one. And how that's resolved is going to be a big question. I think the Russians have clearly shown a preference for having the Kurds take part in the Sochi national dialogue that has been repeatedly delayed, I think, over this continuing conflict between Russia and Turkey on the role of the Kurds. And there could also, I think, be continuing tension with Iran on the role of the militias that it supports inside Syria, in particular in the south and in the de-escalation zone in the south, and Israeli growing discomfort with any sort of Iranian military presence, permanent military presence in Syria. That too, I think, may come up as an issue. But I guess, and I'll just stop here because I don't want to simply repeat what others have said. But I think my bottom line is keep an eye on what's happening on the ground inside Syria. That's really what's going to determine what a political solution ultimately looks like.
Thank you, Mona, and thank you for these analysis. I have a few questions for the panelists before opening the floor for discussion. And I will start with the order of the panel. The first question is Hassan. In your analysis, you never mentioned the role of the Gulf countries or Saudi Arabia. And while I think just before or while the Sochi meeting was taking place, there was another opposition meeting, I think, in Riyadh for the Saudi-backed opposition. So what will be the role or the position of these countries about a possible process in Syria?
I mean,
given the rapid
yeah.
changes in the internal dynamics as well.
That's both the kind of the clearest and the least clear, because clearest in the sense a lot of it is happening behind the scenes.
Yes.
And if you're exposed to what's happening behind the scenes, the conversations, I think it's been clear for a while, specifically since January 2017, this year basically, earlier this year, when the Gulf states, obviously when you talk about the Gulf states, you talk about two camps.
Yeah.
There's Qatar and Qatar equals basically Turkey. Whatever Turkey does, Qatar does almost at the same thing. And once Turkey changed its priorities in the summer of changed its policy, if you like, probably better, in the summer last year, Qatar had little leeway to maneuver inside Syria. Because the northern front was closed, because Turkey was kind of leading the effort and trying to work with Russia on some issues, and in the south with Jordan and others, Qatar had already been blocked from accessing that front. So Qatar has kind of been out of the equation for quite a while, specifically for a year now. The other ones, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I think they shifted towards more of kind of a way, even to convince the United States to stay away from removing Bashar Assad and move away into countering Iran inside Syria. And there are specifics about this, but basically it's they had conversations with the new administration in the beginning, and they wanted to include that kind of philosophy in the plan against Bashar Assad. Now, what Russia is doing, and I will talk about the Riyadh conference in a bit, but what Russia is doing is actually sort of there's a dog whistle sort of thing there happening. Russia indicating to both the Americans and the Gulf states that their role inside Syria is actually plays out against the Iranian dominance inside Syria, and they're sending these things even when Putin met Bashar Assad on Monday. You could feel that when only Bashar Assad came there. He had no aides, nobody was with him, and no kind of Iranians, and even the anti-Iran project inside Syria, or what it looks like an anti-Iran project inside Syria, which is the Hassan, the Syrian militia guy, who works very closely with the Russians to build an anti-militia sort of, or kind of to shore up the Syrian military, Syrian institutions, as opposed to an Iranian-led militia organization inside Syria. That was also kind of a signal, not just that Russia is actually doing things on the ground and the Syrians owe the Russians so much, but also a kind of a signal that we're there as a or the Russian project there is actually is in line with how the Americans and the Gulf states envision Syria in the future. That somehow by shoring up Bashar Assad and his regime, you automatically reduce the need for Bashar Assad to resort to Iran, and therefore the Iranian influence will be checked inside Syria. I heard that directly from senior Gulf officials, and we heard it later from American officials that they reached out to them for the same thing. For the Riyadh conference, I think that was a fiasco or not a fiasco, also depending on how you see it. The
How you see it.
Exactly. The Saudis envisioned the conference in tandem with the Americans to change the Syrian opposition makeup into a more moderate, pragmatic opposition. So they wanted to gather and reshape and kind of remove the extremists, if you like, from the opposition bodies and bring in a more kind of a more pragmatic opposition that understands that things have moved on and you need to basically move on as well. Now that was more of an American push against for the Saudis to do that, and when the Saudis did it, they also wanted to please and appease the Turks and Turkey especially. So they brought in some Islamists and some kind of Turkish backed opposition to the conference, even though Saudi Arabia and the UAE were at war with Qatar for that specific reason. And the Saudis quietly, they were saying that was a major fiasco in the sense that we didn't achieve what we wanted, and we ended up having almost the same Syrian opposition and kind of tarnished our image by signaling that we're actually accepting Bashar Assad publicly.
Thank you. Andrew, two questions. One is in regards to foreign policy decision making in this town. So who's going to run the Syria file in this town? So far it was with CENTCOM to fight against ISIS, but who would be in charge in Washington, D.C.?
On the Syria file, I think that to be completely accurate, for some time, there was a Syria policy under the previous administration, but the largest operational component of it was the anti-ISIL strategy, Operation Inherent Resolve, and that continues to be the main game. It's shifting now from combating ISIS and depleting its military grip on territory to preventing it to come back. So that, if you look at the statements that have come out recently, Secretary Mattis has been pretty clear. I don't think the U.S. is going to, and this gets us into Syria policy, is not going to withdraw from Syria. I think it's going to stay there for the foreseeable future. It might not in the same posture. I think, from what I can read, is we're maybe moving back to a pre-Raqqa operation posture where, obviously there were these talks between President Trump and President Erdogan, where weapons were supposedly cut off from the YPG. Well, previously we didn't provide weapons to the YPG. We provided it to the SDF, to SAC, and specifically, not to get into too much alphabet soup, the Syrian Arab Coalition. So we could be moving back into that. We could be moving back into de-escalation zone being applied to eastern Syria, where now we have a deconfliction, not too many Ds, but we have a deconfliction agreement out there, but we could be. But I think increasingly, in terms of overall policy, as the campaign to defeat ISIS militarily changes, this allows in a lot of other players, whether it's in the stabilization aspects of U.S. policy. It also allows in the anti-Iranian aspects of U.S. policy. And in that, I think one thing about this administration is that there's a lot of deliberation between the principals about this, and I think slowly but surely everything kind of goes up to the top. Again, the big question is, how does all this fit into the Iran posture? Because it's hard to roll back Iran in the region without looking at Syria. Given the way that the war has unfolded. And Mona's right, this is being dictated by events on the ground. It's just all the events on the ground militarily are off the chart. Well, let me put it this way. It was well known among those of us who dealt in policy that the issue of the degree to which the Assad regime's manpower was depleted during the war. It was severely depleted because, Assad is Assad. People don't want to go and fight for them. They would rather not fight for him, or just or fight against him in many cases in the opposition. So he's been unable to bring people in the military, and the Iranians escalated in Syria to support that, both in the Syrian military, with organizing some units, and also with Shia militia. And so this was obscured until the de-escalation agreement in southwest Syria, which allowed the regime supposedly to throw its forces out east to fight ISIS. But when it did throw its forces out east to fight ISIS, what was exposed was the very heavy Iranian involvement. Mm-hmm. And so what complicates this is, and again, it gets down to, I don't understand Iran's posture. Maybe it's just a result of the recent political developments, I'm not sure. But instead of being subtle about this, they're openly talking about the land bridge or the corridor, the strategic benefits of it. You have Hassan Nasrallah, out openly declaring victory. These kind of developments can shift policy. There is one, another major difference between this administration and the last one, and I think it bears on this, is that this administration just regards Iran and the region differently. It does not regard it as it regards it as an anti-status quo force. It's not a whereas I think the previous administration was trying to deal with a nuclear agreement, and then to the best degree possible and diplomatically, and then was not turning a blind eye to Iranian activities in the region, but was willing to give them sort of a pass while they got the JCPOA up and sort of solidified.
My second question was in regards to Iran, so you partly answered that question. Do you want to add anything to Andrew?
I mean, the only thing I would add is I largely agree with Andrew's analysis, but I think what's important is to bear in mind that the stakes for the Assad regime and Iran and allied militias are existential. And I think it's really important to understand that in terms of the decisions they take, and it might in part explain the brazenness of Iran on this. And it may also, to Hassan's point, illustrate the limits of what a Saudi strategy of bolstering Assad so that he doesn't have to rely so much on the Iranians will do. And I think it spells, quite frankly, a lot of trouble down the road in terms of the extent and depth of and breadth of conflict. So that's really the only point I would underscore. I think it's something we did not fully appreciate about Assad in the beginnings of this civil war, and that is that for Assad, the stakes were and remain existential. And I think that really does make a difference in terms of what this very brutal regime is willing to do, how far it's willing to go, and to some extent, I think we therefore, and I don't know who the we is. I'll say I, as an analyst, certainly underestimated his resilience and his staying power, and I think that was a critical lapse in analysis that in part led us to where we are today in Syria.
Or certainly what would be required to remove him.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was major. I think to declare that as a policy objective, but to not put the means. I mean, I think it was pretty. I agree with Mona. I think for the Iranians, it's strange, for the Iranians and the Assad regime, it is existential. But we are entering an interesting phase. I don't want to say that this everything is written here, because it's not. With this brazenness, with this approach, and despite the fact it's existential, the Assad regime and the Iranians now have a pretty big burden to bear going forward, and it's sometimes comes up in reconstruction. But I think there are just serious doubts about they might be able to bring some order to parts of Syria or large swaths of Syria. Whether they're going to bring stability is another matter, and are refugees going to return to that is another huge question that can weigh on this process from a whole host of angles, including from an American angle, from when you get into reconstruction, which the U.S. has said, we're not going to spend a dime on reconstruction in Assad regime areas. Well, even if the U.S. doesn't do it, the kind of people that have that kind of cash to make that kind of stuff happen are the Gulf Arabs, right? And they're under the current circumstance, I can't see them investing in that either. So, I think we're interested. I don't think everything is written here. The trends are, as Mona said. I mean, the trends. Assad has, and the Russians and the Iranians have played their cards very well with relatively and escalating in an incremental way. The question is whether they can win the peace, and that I think is far from clear.
Can I just, not to belabor this, but I don't think they care if they win the peace.
They might not. I mean, the Russians or the Iranians.
The Russians or the Syrians. I mean, the regime. I don't think the regime really cares about, it wants control, but I don't think it cares about stability. In fact, there is an argument that could be made that this regime prefers
Instability
and a broken
arsonist
Syria.
and the fireman.
And also that refugees, so what? I mean, so I think I would push back a little. I think we have to continually check our assumptions and check how we view this conflict and how we view the challenges. And if we view it from our perspective, which absolutely I would agree with you, stability and frankly a de-escalation of conflict is in the U.S. interest, I would say, and is in the region's interest. It is in global interests in Syria. I don't think Bashar al-Assad shares that analysis.
I have more questions about this, but especially while talking about underestimating Russia, I have questions, but first I want to ask about the Turkey's position to Kadir, especially the Idlib operation of Turkey and its impact for these processes.
Yeah. Actually, this ties into the discussion just happened. I agree, Mona, like Assad regime may not care, but it may not be up to them anymore. Like we saw how Putin, the choreography of the whole thing, how, Assad couldn't walk beside him and all that.
It's a protocol issue.
It is, okay, you can simply say it's a simple protocol issue.
It's a Russian sovereign base, right?
Exactly.
So,
Well,
there you go,
exactly.
yeah.
So but it is telling in the sense that I think
Definitely.
Russia was not entirely happy about their sort of Geneva show up for a day and then take off. So I just want to underline the point. It's not quite up to Assad regime how that final end game
I think
will look like.
I think it depends in part, though, on the relative influence of Russia versus Iran in this.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I was just going to say Russia, Iran, Turkey, and then the U.S., depending on how much they want to put into this, are just as important as how Assad feels. But of course, these actors, their rationale for keeping Assad there is also the so-called state structure and all that. But Assad regime can spoil everything. Like with the Idlib question, Kilic, you asked, Turkey is watching out for its sort of narrow national interest there by trying to contain YPG, ensuring a division between sort of SDF or YPG-dominated areas in the east and the west. And it's doing that with sort of this pseudo-agreement with HTS, or their sort of, how do you say, them looking the other way without having much of a choice. And that's been discussed and criticized in other media. But what Turkey is trying to do there seems to me like if you start a military operation in Idlib in the name of fighting terrorists, and that's what I think, if it was totally up to regime, they would do that, and I think they could still do it. That's a potential spoiler. But does Russia want that, and is Russia going to be just happy with this limited intervention of Turkey that sort of keeps Idlib in a more or less stable situation? Because we've all the analysts have written about how many civilians there are in Idlib and how they fled from other regions of Syria. And if you have a new round of conflict in Idlib, this political solution could be postponed for another couple of years as well. So Idlib is critical. Turkey's intervention is critical. It would make, if Turkey entered from the south, essentially coming in between HTS and the Assad regime, that would make it sort of Russia, that would signal that Russia really doesn't want Assad to do anything in Idlib, and it would rather Turkey control this area. But we are not there yet. Turkey is not in the south, so it's a limited intervention in that sense. It's deconflicting between sort of HTS and opposition and YPG, let's say, but not necessarily between the regime and the HTS in the south.
Hassan, do you want to add something?
I want to agree with you on that, and also related to whether we did actually underestimate Bashar Assad's strength back in the day. Yeah, I think the perspective is important, because in 2014, or up until the summer of 2014, it was Iran that was shoring up the Assad regime. They were helping him, right? We can agree or disagree on how much or how far they were helping him. Then in 2014, Iran sort of failed to support or kind of help Bashar Assad 100%. So with the advance or the advent of the Islamic Caliphate or Islamic State. What happened then is that the United States came into the scene, and the intervention helped lift up some of the fighting inside Syria. So the United States was doing half of the fighting for Bashar Assad, because otherwise ISIS would have been more of a threat to Bashar Assad and to his regime at the time, as they were advancing into regime territory. So if you think about it, indirectly, the United States was doing also, in addition to Iran, some of the fighting for Bashar Assad. And then in 2015, both failed to help Bashar Assad as Jaish al-Fatah started to advance into the coastal region in western Syria. So Russia had to intervene to help both Bashar Assad and Iran and supplement the U.S. campaign inside Syria. Inside Syria. So Bashar Assad needed multiple layers of support along the way in order to be able to control what it has controlled so far, and that's around 50% of Syria still, right? So I think that is important, because it's not. I think I agree with you, with both of you, that as Bashar Assad can afford to have some instability in Syria for many years, probably a decade. That's not what it matters to Bashar Assad as much as to his allies. So you have the support of his allies inside Syria, how long they're going to stay there, and how their relationship will evolve along the way. And in addition to all this, you have Turkey is present in Syria with the areas, safe zones backed by Turkey, and the SDF inside Syria. Will Bashar Assad be able, with his regime, obviously, with his allies, to go and take Raqqa and take the rest of Deir ez-Zor and Hasaka and Aleppo, and Aleppo as in the countryside of Aleppo, and Idlib and so on and so forth? I don't think he can do that. So we have to think realistically about how resilient the regime is, other than that it's still there and will remain there, and Bashar Assad will stay for as long as it takes.
Thank you very much. And I can open the floor for questions now. If you have questions, please your hand and identify yourself. Professor Serwer.
Daniel Serwer, I look at this in part from the point of view of what leverage does the United States have anymore? And I can think of 3 points of leverage.
Can you approach it?
Hold it closer to your mic.
3 points of leverage. Territory, including the oil on that territory, including even the territory Turkey occupies, because there is influence on Turkey. Second is reconstruction funding.
Exactly.
And the third and most foggy is diplomatic influence, because eventually somebody is going to want a new UN Security Council resolution that seals off this war. because that's how wars end these days. Is there anything else we've got? What cards do we hold today?
Time.
To the panel?
Yeah.
Do you want to start
I'm not
one?
sure I'd even agree with the three you laid out. I mean, I don't know how much leverage we have, but my sense is each of the three that you laid out has a, not a negative, but is dilute in some way. So it's not us that's holding that territory. It's the SDF and the Kurds, and there is the possibility of the Kurds and the Russians and the Syrian regime making a deal. And so, if the Kurds sense that we are tepid or weak, and we might actually, Mattis's statements and others aside, are maybe looking to pull out, they may make a very astute calculation that they would rather, they don't need, Raqqa is really not part of the historic Rojava, and maybe there's a deal to be made. On the reconstruction, as I'm sure you know, Dan, I mean, there's a very lively debate about how much leverage is that reconstruction assistance actually. And actually, we have said very clearly, we're not even going to use the R word when it comes to Syria. And this well predates where we are today. This is an overhang from Iraq. And so I'm not so sure how much there is there. And then diplomacy, we've just spent quite some time talking about how in some ways the Geneva process has really been eclipsed by what's happened on the ground and by Astana. So I'm not sure that we have that much leverage, would be my answer.
I think a lot of it depends on, again, how this unfolds, how stable it is. Does this large Iranian-backed deployment in Syria breed a jihadist comeback or morphing of these groups? That could be another issue. The major, I mean, you've outlined a lot of them here. The other one to add in there, and it's particularly given the events we've seen last year, is U.S. Military strikes. Now I know that, people. I mean, if after President Trump took over, if you would have said a couple of months later we're going to be enforcing the red line inside of Syria, people would have laughed, right? Mm-hmm. But that actually ended up happening, and not only that. But then Shia militia and Lebanese Hezbollah started making runs at our soft position around Al Tanf, which led to other strikes, which, depending on whether you believe it or not, according to those involved, dramatically helped the U.S. negotiating position with the Russians in Amman. So that kind of stuff can happen, and especially under this presidency. I think this president. He rules from his gut, so to speak. And so despite not wanting to get involved in Syria, which I think he was pretty clear during the campaign that he was more skeptical about what the U.S. could do, in the spring of last year, that dramatically changed. That could happen again. That is an issue. And the reason why that's an issue is that the Russians and the Iranians and the regime know that they don't really have an easy answer to that. I mean, they can mess around with us, they can cause other problems elsewhere, but we're really good at doing this kind of stuff. And also, they don't want us to turn the taps back on to supporting rebels inside the country. They would rather we all go down the path to de-escalation. And that is, if that stalls, if the Iranians start rubbing the opposition's noses in it, so to speak, or our noses in it, that could also cause a change in policy vis-a-vis our posture on Iran. I think this time around, though, maybe the different parties will be a little bit more cautious.
Thank you. Do you want to add something?
Sure. I think you laid it out very well, the point of leverage, in addition to the Israeli, because they are trying de facto enforcing a no-Iran zone in southwestern Syria. And that's important, obviously, because Iran is pushing to do that, and the Israelis are trying to do something else. And Jordan has, at least was at some point, also in line with that policy. They didn't want along their borders any Shia militias and these things, although they might be changing their position today. But the SDF and the kind of that side of Syria is a huge leverage for the U.S. Now, Whether the U.S. will use it, that's another question. And also what they want to do with it, that's also another a second question. Because you hear noises these days about allowing the good state to go back. Good state means like institutions in Syria, apart from the mukhabarat, apart from the intelligence and the military institutions in Syria, to go back to SDF. So education, schools, teachers, and so on and so forth in that region. I think that's a mistake because the regime will use these as a sort of points of leverage against the SDF. And also, I think another, and why do I say that's a leverage? Because I think also it will depend on time. So, for example, if the SDF, regardless of anybody's reservations about them, if they stay in this area and build some semblance of institutions in these areas, that will already become anti-regime or regime-resistant institutions. Meaning, if the regime comes back, you will have already built some sort of local structures that can be that can do different things. And if you build militias in that area, they will confront the regime if the regime wants to go back by force rather than through a political settlement in that area. But the United States, I think one of the biggest mistakes they make, and I keep saying this, with the SDF is that, or what they need to do, is to turn the SDF into a national project rather than a PKK project. So it has to be, and they are doing that, or they try to do that in Raqqa. You have to give them credit with preventing the SDF from teaching the PKK ideology, but they actually have the Syrian curriculum in Syrian in schools in Raqqa. That's one example of what they try to do. Now they haven't been successful, but I think that's the kind of things they should be doing in that area to turn the Syrian Democratic Forces into a national project, meaning it's a Syrian project with a Syrian identity, not a militia or led by militia, because that will be creating a lot of problems, not just for the United States, but also for the Kurds themselves when at some point the United States has to leave and then Turkey is there, and Turkey is gonna, an indication of how committed Turkey is to its national interest in that area is that it started working with Russia last year to prevent the Kurds from expanding further. That should tell you something. That should tell you how committed they are to this. This is a top priority for them. So for the United States to ignore that, I think that'll be a mistake. And the United States can still defend its project inside Syria against Turkey by turning it into a national project that can work for that region long term.
Well, some of this, I wanted to just add a couple words to this. I agree these are points of leverage, but it's going to depend how the U.S. wants to use them and in what way. Next week, military leadership from CENTCOM and Eurocom, it's very interesting, are headed to Turkey. Usually in Turkey, CENTCOM is, leading this fight against ISIS, and they don't really like Turks, as we read from the press, as opposed to EUCOM, which is more pro, Europe, so pro-Turkey, etc. Both leaders are going to Turkey, and obviously number one item in the agenda is YPG, and this cutting off of help to YPG directly. So while the U.S. can use this SDF, like Hassan was talking about, make it more sort of inclusive of Arabs and hopefully, potentially for Turkey, ideally more Arab-dominated rule in that area. Or the U.S. can say, you know what, we're just going to double down and make them the sort of ultimate player here, and they're going to be our buffer against whoever, including Iran, ISIS. So I think it's going to depend on how the U.S. wants to play this and whether they can sort of reassure Turkey in a serious way. And some of that started with the conversation between Erdogan and Trump, and Trump said they're going to stop arming YPG directly. The vocabulary is important. I don't think Turkey is against Kurdish inclusion in that area and Kurdish inclusion in negotiations. But PKK has dominated and overwhelmed both the military operations in that area through YPG and the administrative structures. To what extent you can really involve non-Kurdish groups or non-PKK Kurdish groups as well as Arabs, I think that's critical for Turkey. And then the Iran thing, how big U.S. wants to do the Iran confrontation. I said that at the beginning. So that's another issue that you mentioned in terms of using the leverage. And I think at the Security Council, what you're saying is right, but not necessarily so. We may not necessarily get a resolution. I don't think, things have changed so much with the Syrian war. We have seen so many sort of things that happened that we all thought wasn't going to happen. I don't know, does a security resolution, United Nations Security Council resolution really have to put a seal on this? It may not necessarily happen. So,
Thank you. I can have another question. If not, I will have my own question and wrap it up because we are almost out of time. Erica, you want your question?
Well, sure. I guess one of the questions I was wondering about, first of all, Erica Hanachek with Americans for a Free Syria. Good to meet you all and have you here. So the Iran question, I think one of the things that we've encountered, at least in terms of the thinking on this and what the administration is, especially after Al-Tan with strikes, there was a question of force protection in Iraq, kind of the bigger regional question of how to confront Iran, about the efficacy of sanctions. So what tools does the U.S. have on the Iran issue that can then come back to be leverage for the Geneva negotiations or whatever negotiations there may be?
This is an important question, and it keeps coming. The question of Iran keeps coming, and I remember that in the first, during the Obama administration, we had the same kind of ghost of Iran haunting the Syria question as well. Some of the members of the administration who became critical were telling that Obama, at this point, his priority is the nuclear deal because of that led Iranian militia to at least, they have some kind of space in Syria. So if we want to speculate a little more about the Iranian question, what will be the future of U.S. policy here? And go ahead.
Well, I think it's two questions. The
Sure.
future of U.S. policy seems that it is very much moving toward a more confrontational stance with Iran. And that's evident from statements from National Security Advisor McMaster and General Mattis, the president himself. So pushing back on Iran in various parts of the region. However, and I think this is relevant for Syria, I think that what we learned, for example, in Lebanon, and with the moves by the Saudis to force Saad Hariri to resign, the U.S. stepped in a different way and pushed back and said, that, hang on a second, I mean, this is actually quite destabilizing for Lebanon. So I'm not sure how much we're able to do in Syria or other proxy arenas. We could do whatever. I mean, we've got the most powerful military in the world. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could do. But I think a necessary part of the calculus is what are the costs of those pushbacks, whether it's in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, wherever it is. And to actually be very clear-eyed and to lift up and be very, very transparent that in pushing back and in destabilizing, there is necessarily greater destabilization that occurs, and that comes at a price. That comes at a price in terms of, certainly from a humanitarian perspective, it comes at a price in terms of deepening conflict, humanitarian access, displacement, both internally and as refugees, in a place like Lebanon, and I'm sorry I'm taking us a little further afield from Syria, but in some ways I think it's a similar thought process, but certainly in Lebanon, a place that's very, very fragile, that's hosting more refugees per capita than any other country in the world. I think rightly there was a calculation made that, something pushing Saad Hariri out or doing things to sort of poke our finger in the eye of Hezbollah and then by extension Iran, the price for that in terms of Lebanese stability in that instance is too high. So I don't have a good answer for your question. To my mind, it really is a very delicate balance and calculation that needs to be made about the costs and benefits of engaging in proxy wars with Iran across the region.
I would add to that if you look at the entire, so if you look at the Iran strategy, maybe it's just a factor of the way, sort of the media has evolved or devolved or however way you want to look at this. But so much of the headline was about the JCPOA because it's a major political football. It's all teed up and so on. But actually, if you look at the strategy, 90% of it's about the IRGC, but Quds Force specifically, right? So you think like, okay, so if you take that, and it very clearly, it's not designed to defeat Iran as much as to what they could say neutralize it. Mm-hmm. And I think neutralizing it and sort of rolling it back would be the general objective trends. How do you do that in the region? Well, you can do it in the policy thus far. The sanctions aspect is more fleshed out. The Bab al-Mandab, Yemen aspect is more fleshed out. We're waiting for the operational components on Syria and Iraq, and that's where this gets into our discussion today, and that is it is difficult to escalate and to roll back Iran in Syria without kicking off the war in at least parts of Syria again. Now, the way this, we're not the only players here, though. So the big question mark is what the Israelis are going to do, right? Because it's kind of like everybody always talks about the Syrian war being the 30 years war, and I have a degree in history, but I'm certainly not an expert in that war. Although my personal family was displaced by that war, and that's the reason why we're all here. So I guess I'm proof that you can live fight or live another day. But one of the interesting things about the way that war shook out is that in the end, when the Habsburgs were going to win almost the entire table, it was the intervention of France, completely against their previous position, that ended up leading to the Peace of Westphalia and the way that war shook out with all the violence and displacement that went along with it. So the question is, can a more assertive Israeli strategy, Israeli response to this new order in Syria, change the chessboard? And I think it's hard to say because they're very good at firing into Syria. They're very good at blowing up missile facilities and being very specific about chemical weapons and so on. But politically, I think the Israelis don't have a big game there because of the natural constraints in the region and the way the various issues in the region are already teed up and have been historically. So that could be a major way that the U.S. might just be like, yeah, okay, we're just going to, Iran, you want to administer Syria and deal with all this stuff, go right ahead. You can pay for it, and you can deal with the Israelis too. And by the way, don't be surprised if you get whacked if you don't get 5 kilometers off of the Golan frontier, or 10 or 15 or whatever. And that could just go on that's probably going to go on anyway. So they might just be like, okay, this is just the new normal. And that in itself wouldn't restart the war, but it would contribute to it. It would keep the Iranians at least from burrowing in further, perhaps, or into those areas of Syria. But in terms of the overall map of Syria, you would need to have a military response in other areas outside of the southwest in order to roll them back. And that I don't see very easily for a whole host of reasons that we've already talked about. All things remaining equal.
It's just a short intervention on this. Maybe.
As you see, we can continue this discussion for the next 3 hours.
Well, I think we are talking tactics. We talk about the broad goal of whatever that goal is exactly, confronting Iran, but mostly tactics. What Iran has now reached into various parts of the region, particularly because of the Iraq war and Syria war, particularly because of instability and civil wars. So I think broad geopolitical confrontation, if you want to roll back Iran in that sense, meaning reduce their regional influence, then you have no choice but to somehow come to some sort of stability in Syria and Iraq. Otherwise, like Andrew is saying, if it's going to be a game of what do you say, whack-a-mole, and they hit each other in the Syrian scene, that's instability, that's lack of peace, that's violation of territorial integrity and all that, right? When you include all these actors, if they can't come to a broad agreement like that, they won't be able to, I think, geopolitically confront Iran. That's what I would say.
I do have a plan for Iran in Syria, though. No, like seriously, I think there are two ways of countering Iran very briefly. One, I think it's too late, which is involving the regime and regime areas. That's Iran will be always there. And the other one was something I talked about last time I was here on this in this space, which was the arc from the eastern, the kind of the countryside of Aleppo to eastern Syria all the way to Daraa. There's so many favorable conditions that you can actually prevent Iran from going there. It's important for the security of Iraq and for any strategy in Iraq. That's a border strategy as well. So you need to have allies along the way that can shield you from, or can prevent Iran from going there. Now the problem is, since then, since I was here last time, Iran has already carved out some kind of opened that space between Abu Kamal and Tanf, right, for themselves. But there is an extra thing that happened that I didn't imagine would happen, which is that Idlib now is under the sphere of influence, Turkey's sphere of influence. So there's an added area stretching from Idlib all the way to the Golan Heights, if you count Israeli policy there, with the exception of that corridor, that space, that channel into Iraq. That area, I think, the rollback strategy is tied into the strategy of preventing jihadis from going there. It just happens that the two are linked. You don't have to fight Iran. It's not about Iran. It's about preventing jihadis like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and whatever you want to call it today from going to that area. That's an essential region for them. That's the area they wanted to operate for so long. So the rollback versus the roll-in, as in preventing or allowing Iran to roll into these areas, are tied together. You need to really decide. You want to prevent jihadists from going back, or you don't want to prevent jihadists from going back. And if you have the right plan to, just ensure that this area, which is more than half of Syria, is yours or under the influence of your allies, whether Israel or Jordan or Turkey, or the SDF or whatever you want to call it there, then I think that will achieve so much for the U.S. in that region. And also prevent a headache in the future, which is the jihadi return.
Thank you very much. I know there are some questions, but we are almost out of time. So thank you for coming today, and happy holidays. And please join me to thank for our panelists.